Welcome everyone, bienvenidos. Welcome everyone. Before we begin, I want to remind all attendees to please sign into the link provided in the chat by Nane. If you have any issues with signing in, please make sure to direct message her. If you have any questions during the course of the presentation, please make sure to direct them to Hoover and we will address them at the conclusion of the presentation. Also, a short survey will be shared in the chat by Nane toward the end of the event. So please take a couple of minutes to complete this survey for us. We have ASL interpretation services by Jo Beth and Jamie and closed captioning provided by Margaret. You can enable closed captioning by selecting live transcript and enabling captions. Thank you for being here. Lastly, this is a reminder that this event will be recorded, so please adjust your settings to your preference. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to offer a land acknowledgement on behalf of the Planning Committee. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life. And some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. We are currently occupying ancestral land of the Tongva people. In our work to promote social justice and education, we must always consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. With that being said, I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's presentation for Latinx Heritage Month. This is Glendale Community College's second year observing Latinx Heritage Month, and our theme for this year is celebrating our diverse stories, voices, and identities. The Planning Committee selected the theme to celebrate the unique individuals within the Latinx community, despite the various challenges they have faced in this country. Lastly, it is an honor to introduce Blanca Ramirez, who will be discussing the topic, A Conversation on the U.S. Immigration Enforcement System. Blanca Ramirez is a PhD candidate in the sociology department at the University of Southern California, also known as USC. She is a scholar of immigration, gender, and sociology of law. Her dissertation explores the broader consequences of a deportation regime, including the implications of local policies on immigration lawyering. Her dissertation was recently awarded the 2021 Haynes Lindley Doctoral Dissertation Fellowship. Blanca earned her BA at California State University, Fullerton. She is a first-generation college student, and given her journey to higher education, Blanca is passionate about helping others learn. With that being said, it is my pleasure to welcome Blanca Ramirez.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Priscilla, for that wonderful introduction. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about immigration enforcement, and I just want to note that I envision a good portion of this presentation as a conversation, so there'll be moments during this presentation where I'll be asking you to participate either in the chat or if you feel comfortable doing so by unmuting yourself. And so with that, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to share my screen, and on this image, you should be able to see Pershing Square, which is in downtown LA. So drop a reaction if you've been by Pershing Square, if you know of it, if you walked by downtown LA. So I see one reaction so far. Yeah, I see a couple of you. So Pershing Square is in downtown LA, and right across the street from this image, you would see a building like this. And this building is actually one of the immigration courts in downtown LA. And on a pre-pandemic day, you might even see a line of individuals lined up to go into immigration court. both people that are waiting to have their cases heard and immigration attorneys and their families in line. So as I go through this presentation and we talk about immigration enforcement, I just wanted to take a moment to remind everyone that this is very much an LA story. Immigration enforcement happens in LA neighborhoods, in LA communities, and it impacts the LA larger immigrant community. So to give you a snapshot of what detention and deportation looks like today, and why sociologists consider this an era of mass detention and mass deportation, it's because if you look at the graph, it's reached an unprecedented level of, we reach an unprecedented level of immigrant detainees. As you can tell from the graph, detention has grown exponentially across several administrations. In 1980, there were approximately 1,600 detainees, while in 2019, that number reached 49,000 individuals detained every day. Deportation, as you can imagine, has had a similar increase. In the 1980s, there were approximately 23,000 individuals deported, and by 2014, that number was 400,000 in a year. So when sociologists refer to the system of mass detention and mass deportation, it is something recent. It is something that's been cemented. Sociologists usually point to various laws in 1996. So it's approximately 20 years of policies and laws being passed that have built the system up to this massive scale. And it's been crafted over several administrations, both Democrats and Republicans have created laws and policies that have built up the deportation machine. I don't know how many of you remember when President Obama was in office, among immigrant advocates, he had earned the name Deporter-in-Chief for the number of deportations that happened under his administration. So today I'm going to be addressing three different aspects. How did we get here? Who are those facing the system of immigration enforcement? And the third question, what are the broader implications of detention and deportation? So the first is, how did we get here? We can characterize the changes in the law in three different ways. The first is that laws have been created for a demand for immigrants to be put into detention centers. How many of you have heard of the private prison industry? Maybe drop a thumbs up if you've heard of this before. Okay, can I ask any one of those who put their thumbs up if they feel comfortable sharing what they know about the private prison industry?
Is there a specific something you wanted to be shared?
Maybe like a definition of the concept of private prison industry.
So basically, there's a whole industry of prisons that are for profit. So their goal is to, I guess, keep the costs at the lowest possible level, spending per prisoner, while I guess giving some basic services, but basically what ends up happening is they actually end up treating the prisoners very inhumanely for the amount of contracts and pay that they get from the government, who contracts the prisons to run that system.
Yeah, thank you, Hoover. That was a really good overview of the private prison industry. And usually when we're referring to the private prison industry, we then tend to think of it as it happening in the criminal legal system. But likewise, it also happens in the immigration enforcement system. Just like Hoover shared, the government contracts out the services of detention to a private prison. And in immigration, we know it's approximately $100 per day per person for every day for their detention period. So in 1980, when DHS was INS, Immigration Naturalization Service, they signed a contract with Corrections Corporation of America. And today, more than 70% of those who are being held in immigration detention are being detained in a private detention center. And then in 2004, the Immigration Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act required ICE to grow the capacity for the detention system within the US. In 2009, this act required ICE to fund a minimum number of beds every day. GEO Group receives more taxpayer dollars for immigration detention than any other ICE contractor. In 2017, GEO Group received approximately $184 million, followed by Corrections Corporation of America that received $135 million for immigration detention related service obligation. So that number, like Hoover said, shows sort of the wealth, the money involved in immigration detention. The second sort of major change that happened in immigration law is that we've expanded those we've considered deportable. In 1996, the Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act expanded the grounds on which non-citizens, including legal permanent residents, could be deported by expanding this category called aggravated felony. When it was initially enacted, this term referred only to murder, federal drug trafficking, and illicit trafficking of certain firearms. Later, it was redefined to include any felony or misdemeanor where the court imposed the sentence to at least 1 year in prison with no regard if it was actually served or not. So today, that includes things like shoplifting. And once an individual has committed an aggravated felony, they fall under mandatory detention and they are eligible for deportation. So this law reclassified both undocumented migrants and legal permanent residents as deportable. Some of them, because they fall under mandatory detention, they have to, while their court proceedings are lingering on or while they're waiting for the next court hearing, they must remain in immigration detention. And how many of you have heard of DACA or TPS? You can drop a thumbs up again. I see a couple of you are familiar with DACA or TPS. So during the last couple of years, we've seen sort of these threats of termination to these statuses. And we can think of those threats to terminate these status as a reclassification of people from having a liminal status to now being classified as deportable. So these statuses, every time they get redefined or terminated, it's reclassifying those individuals, those social groups as deportable. Finally, the last thing I want to touch upon is that immigration law has put in mechanisms to identify the deportable population by using interior immigration enforcement. So ICE doesn't actually have the capacity to be patrolling the streets of US cities and identifying individuals for deportation. Instead, what happens is that it relies on local law enforcement to identify individuals eligible for deportation. So in 1996, again, with IDA, 287G is a statute of that, and it allowed for ICE to enter into cooperation agreements with state and local law enforcement. So based on these 287G agreements, it allowed for electronic data sharing. And under the jail enforcement model, deputized officers may interrogate suspected non-citizens who have been arrested on state and local charges, and then ICE may place immigrant detainers on those who are subject for removal. Interestingly, studies have found that traffic violations are the most common charge for individuals incarcerated through the 287G program. And only about 13% of those identified through the 287G were actually charged with felonies. And when researchers further look into what correlates with jurisdictions adopting 287G, it found that it wasn't the rate of crime that was correlated with the implementation of 287G programs, but rather the rate of Latino population growth in the area. And generally what they found is that if that growth was higher than national average, it was more likely that that the local jurisdiction would pass 287G agreements. So through these 3 different laws, we've sort of changed our immigration enforcement system within the last 20 years. And through these mechanisms, we've increased our capacity for immigration detention and deportation. And this is all funded by US taxpayers. I'm going to move on now to talk about who are those facing the immigration enforcement system. What is an immigration court process like? So I'm going to ask someone to read this slide for me. If you could raise your hand so I. No worries if anyone can't unmute themselves, or I think I see it, Sal.
It is the practice of incarcerating non-US citizens while the removal proceedings resolve, defined as non-punitive.
Yes, thank you, Itzel. So immigration detention, just like Itzel read, refers to the practice of confining individuals. And because immigration violations are administrative, they're civil, it's not considered a criminal procedure. So it is the practice of incarcerating non-US citizens while they await their removal proceedings to be resolved. But some scholars actually have termed this as a paradox. So why might this be the case? Why might scholars call immigration detention a paradox? So if you want to raise your hand, if you have any thoughts on this. Okay, how about I show you what an immigration detention center looks like, and you all can maybe find the paradox of why immigration detention, while it's legally not considered punishing someone. So I'm going to jump to my pictures right now. And this is actually a detention center nearest to us, which is in Adelanto, which is about 2 hours away near Esperia in sort of the desert area, if you all are familiar with it. So anyone have any thoughts about why immigration detention is a legal paradox, according to some scholars?
Is it because maybe they're not treated well?
Yeah. So it's supposed to be like not punishing, right? And I think also there's some people commenting on the chat, and Nusha, I hope I'm getting your name right. They wrote, detention is punishment, period. It's the removal of freedom. And combining that with Itzel, what Itzel told us, scholars consider this punishment because it is removing people of their freedom. While legally it's defined as not punitive and not punishing, it can still feel very much like punishment. And if I hadn't told you that this was a detention center, would you have known the difference between this and a criminal legal setting? Yeah, thanks for participating, Itzel and Hoover. So I'm going to continue on with the rest of my presentation. So who can the United States legally detain? Asylum seekers, legal permanent residents, and undocumented immigrants. Now, sociologists have looked into who is actually being detained, and they've come up with different arguments. So sociologists Galash Boza and Andanusa Tallo have highlighted that deportations between 1997 and 2012 have actually targeted Latino working class men. So while Latino working class men are only, I forget the exact sort of statistical number of it, but they're disproportionately represented in removal proceedings. And they point to one, that it's the male joblessness crisis. So post-recession in the United States, we witnessed a job crisis in Latino male majority labor market sectors, such as construction and building trades. And so they argue that there's just less of an economic demand for immigrant male workers. And so this makes their labor more disposable to our current economic system. Second, they argue that racial profiling, the criminalization of Latino men, have led to more Latino working class men being placed into these systems. So cooperation between law enforcement and immigration law enforcement can turn programs like 287G. And we know from other studies that racial profiling exists. And so routine traffic stops can turn into deportation for some of these men. Literature also shows that programs like 287G have disproportionately targeted Latinos. And some scholars have called what is happening in some of these jurisdictions as driving while brown. And more recently, studies are pointing to the disproportionate representation of Black immigrants in detention. Black immigrants only make up about 5% of the unauthorized population, but they make up around 20% of those in immigration detention. Black immigrants are also disproportionately represented among detained immigrants facing deportation in immigration court because of criminal grounds. So while 14% of immigrants detained while facing deportation proceedings have criminal grounds of removability, half of all Black immigrants in removal proceedings have criminal grounds for removability. So we've seen these pictures now. Oh, it's slightly blurry, but this is the inside of the immigration courtroom. Now I have a short clip I wanted to share with you all that there's not as much research yet on COVID and the lived experience of immigration detention, but I wanted to share a clip from a recent Spotify episode on this. So I'm gonna hit play and please let me know if it works.
For months, Jose and his boyfriend were forced to.
Is it working? Is it working? Were you all able to hear?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. And just to give you a little background, in this episode, the reporter has been speaking with 2 asylum seekers who are detained in the Otay Mesa Detention Center. And here they talk about their experience of being detained, and the COVID epidemic sort of hits while they're in detention and they're narrating their experience. So there is some Spanish in the audio, but the reporter then jumps in English. So if you have language difficulties, it'll later be translated in English.
Pay an extortion fee to local gang members to stay alive. But after the same gang members severely beat and assaulted Jose and his boyfriend, they knew they had to flee for their lives. Jose believed the United States would be a haven for the LGBTQ community, and he could live freely as a gay man. But violence and intimidation followed him everywhere.
Lo personal, yo y mi pareja ya tenemos un año de andar huyendo. En México también hemos sido secuestrados, hemos sido abusados, discriminados.
3 months after leaving El Salvador, Jose and his boyfriend arrived in Mexico, where he said they were discriminated against too, and kidnapped. Still, they persisted and continued on the journey north. But when they got to the border, they were forced to remain in Mexico under Trump's Migrant Protections Protocols program. It would be 3 more months until they could finally start their asylum process as part of the less than 1% of migrants that fire inside the detention center.
La mayoría de personas estamos con gripe, dolor de cuerpo, fiebre.
He said everyone in his pod was feeling sick, including him. Standing at 350,000 square feet, Otay Mesa, which is owned by Core Civic, has the capacity to hold nearly 1,500 migrants, making it the second largest detention center in California and one of the 15 biggest in the nation.
José, ¿cuántas personas duermen en el mismo cuarto?
8 personas.
¿Y como cuántas personas están en tu tanque?
Ahorita vemos como 104, como 104 o 103 personas.
Jose told me there were over 100 people in his pod, with 8 people sleeping in each cell, making it nearly impossible to social distance. Soon after, Jose became one of the 27,000 migrants to test positive for COVID-19 inside an ICE detention center. At the time, Otay Mesa actually had the largest outbreak of COVID-19 among all ICE detention centers in the nation. And although many like Jose recovered fully, some weren't so lucky.
Okay, I'm gonna stop it there. Is there any initial reaction from hearing that clip and hearing Jose's experience being detained while COVID was hitting? Itzel shared that she didn't know this was happening. Horrifying. Now, I also want us to take a second and think about why my conditions like this make it harder to fight for your case in immigration court. Because everyone who's detained in immigration detention is fighting their case in court, whether it's asylum or removal proceedings. And so why might these experiences make it harder to fight your case?
Maybe because the courts are closed. They're not high on the priority list.
Yeah, thank you, Alice. Yeah, some courts did close down during COVID and they weren't able to have their day in court and had to remain detained. Itzel also wrote, you cannot attend to fight your case because you got sick, and that's another real possibility. So we'll come back to this. But I also wanted to highlight that a few more obstacles for detained immigrants fighting to seek relief in immigration court while they are detained. So about 50% of all facilities are located outside major urban areas. And 60% of individuals who are detained are located outside of major urban areas. So why might being away from a major urban areas make it difficult to fight your case? If you're located far away from a major urban city, Alice wrote, less immigration lawyers. Yes, there are less immigration lawyers. You cannot, while you're detained, you cannot go out and find an immigration lawyer to represent your case. You have to be calling places to see if hopefully someone can take your case. What about families? We know that family can be an important source of support for individuals fighting their case in court. And if you're located far away, does that make it easy or harder for your family to come visit? Yeah, so when we think even here in LA, where some people can be detained in Adelanto, which is 2 hours away, that can be difficult to take time off work, to find a reliable car, to take you all the way up to Adelanto to have a family visit and to be a source of support for someone facing the system. We've also, on the Spotify clip that we've heard, there's also poor medical care and neglect that sometimes happens in immigration detention. A Human Rights Watch report stated that there were many cases in immigration detention where medical staff failed to respond to health problems and would take considerable delays in responding. And how many of you have heard of hieleras or know Spanish and know what the word hielera means? So hieleras are, the direct translation in English is an icebox. And hieleras refer to, a cooler. Hieleras refer to this practice that is well documented. There's been congressional testimony on this. Hieleras are sort of the initial holding cells where people are supposed to be held for the initial 24 to 72 hours, where a person is apprehended. Immigration holding cells are known to be put into freezing temperatures where people are initially put in. They also generally do not provide mats for sleeping. There are some individuals who are held there for several nights, meaning that people must sleep on concrete benches or directly on the floor. And this is a common practice. The other thing I want to highlight, because it's been in the news last year, is that there is allegations of sexual abuse. And a Government Accountability Office report found that only about 40% of sexual abuse allegations are reported from the private detention facilities to ICE headquarters. So researchers have found that only about 7% of sexual abuse cases get investigated in immigration detention. So as we move away from this slide and think about the conditions of detention center, not only is it a dehumanizing thing, but also what it means for people trying to fight for their cases and the further obstacle that this adds on trying to get some sort of relief, and what it means to be in a detention facility and held there while having the threat of your court proceedings still happening. So we've been talking and focusing mostly on LA. I have this video here to share about immigration enforcement and what it looked like in a different part of the country, a rural area. So it's about 10 minutes long. And after we watch this clip, we'll come back and talk about what are the broader consequences of immigration enforcement. So as you watch this video, take note of sort of the consequences that are happening, whether they're macro or they're micro interactions. So I'll hit play, hopefully.
They're taking the easy targets, and ICE is there waiting for them when they arrive at work.
I don't think people thought about it. I don't think they believed that people's rights would be trampled on. These are our friends. These are our neighbors. These are people that we value.
He was a great friend. He stood up for a lot of kids.
Shame on me, but I didn't think of how it actually would play out with people that I know.
Yeah, they care about family. Gun control is a big issue here, and that's Democrat and Republican, Libertarian, everybody. And people here also don't want regulation. There are some Republicans here who are delighted with what's going on with the enforcement of immigration. But there are also a number of Republicans who are feeling very distressed and saying this isn't being done the proper way.
I consider myself very politically conservative. I thought it sounded great. I mean, you break the law, by golly. And then when you actually, for me, you start, wait a minute. This year, what we've noticed is a lot of people who have been in our community for a number of years have been arrested and detained by ICE. We're talking people that have been here sometimes 10, 12, even more years. So it's impacting the fisheries, the cannery workers, the cranberry bogs.
So I don't know what they're going to do. I have no idea what they're going to do.
Those are all very much heavily dependent upon migrant workers. But even more so than that, I think people have just been emotionally in turmoil because they've seen people that they've known for years, friends, acquaintances, neighbors, people that have gone to church with, those kind of things, kids are in school together, are just gone.
We've lost about 25 students. We're a district of just a little over 1,000 kids. So for a district our size, it's significant. You know, that's a whole classroom full of kids, basically. Parents are afraid to send their kids to school. They're afraid that, you know, maybe something's going to happen to them while their child is at school, and how's that child going to be taken care of? It added this sense of fear. And so it becomes an emotional, kind of an emotional roller coaster for the kids.
There was just this gigantic herd of people before we left. And I remember just seeing half the people crying. Yeah, there was like a bunch of people just like crying. He was just a great athlete. I used to tell him that I was just so excited for him to run in high school with me for track and just watch him just completely crush it. A couple days before he left, he came over to my house and I remember just hanging out with him and thinking that like I might not see him again.
was the empty seat where that kid was, and hard to explain to classrooms, not understanding how their country is doing this.
They're taking the easy targets, and we have one incident where a lady was selling some things maybe on Craigslist or on the internet, and they set up a time to meet with her and arrested her. I've been told people are just going to work for the day, and ICE is there waiting for them when they arrive at work. And it's frustrating because they have not yet been able to tell us names of people that they're taking away or any details. So sometimes we've had cases where maybe somebody is missing and we don't know if they were taken by ICE or if they're actually a missing person. You know, I have no problem whatsoever in seeing people that are committing crimes deported. Since I've been the sheriff in the last 7 years, I think they've only taken people about a half dozen times from our jail facility.
Had stories that people will kind of disappear and then actually leave the community and kind of go underground.
So people have even been afraid or scared that they're going to come here and be arrested. Or
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You literally cannot replace them. We've gone down to Fresno. We've been down to Arizona to see if we could entice other people to come into the area to work, and it's not real successful.
The turning point for me was a guy that I've known for many years who I found out last summer was picked up. And I didn't know he was here illegally, to be honest with you, but I was like, they picked up Mario?
So before going to college, I decided to go first to the post office and pick my mail. And when I get out of my car, I hear a voice telling me my name. And it was a very friendly voice. So I turn around, I shake hands. At the same time, they were showing me their plates and they said, "You know where we are?" And I said, "Well, yes." So we are going to take you. This is going to happen. I wasn't surprised at all because since this new administration started, everyone is going to be detained. But then I knew that they were going to focus only in criminals. And I'm sure I'm not a criminal. I'm not one of those.
I mean, he's somebody that you'd want to have in your country. He's somebody that's adding to, in a very positive way, our community. And you cannot tell me that our community is better off or that the United States is better off because Mario has been shipped back to Mexico. It's easy to hear sound bites and say, yes, that's great policy. It's different when you're implementing it and you start seeing, now, wait a minute, this is actually affecting these people's lives and that I didn't sign up for this. And shame on me for being short-sighted about it. Okay, I mean, fine, but it's not just. It's not just to me.
So what are the different consequences that you saw happen in this community that they were sharing about? What are the different things you all picked up on?
They're taking.
So I see human and economic tolls, families torn apart, children lose education, trauma for the entire family and the community, dehumanization is being normalized, losing friendships. Anyone want to share? Unmute yourselves and share. disruption of life. Multiple people's lives in this short clip were disrupted. The lack of criminal cause for deportation. So it's not a documentary, it's a short clip. It's from BBC called The Missing. I'm sure if you look it up on YouTube, you might be able to find it. Also, another thing that I want to address head on is, while immigration enforcement does sort of rely on criminality to identify individuals, sociologists generally hold this concept of the double punishment. So when immigrants commit crimes, some of them will serve their case or serve their time in the criminal legal system. And if that's also grounds for detention and deportation, some of them, so scholars call it a double punishment because they are serving time in both the criminal legal system and the immigration enforcement system for the same crime, essentially. So I have a short Padlet activity. So I'm going to put this in the chat. And so here I ask you to think about not only for the video that we saw, but from what we've been sharing so far, and think about the broader consequences of mass immigration enforcement. Thank you for joining us, Nusha. So I saw someone write extreme trauma for many involved. So there are studies done that have documented sort of the severe psychological implications, including depression, anxiety, stigma, aggression, and insomnia that happens among children of deportees. I see someone wrote cost to taxpayers, cost to victims of the system. For social implications, I see loss of community members and what they bring to that community. Someone wrote tearing families apart. Policies constantly changing. So this can be especially the case when we think about the last couple of years with DACA and how DACA has been going through several changes. I also have a few more that I want to share, but feel free to keep commenting on the Padlet. The first is I'm sure some of you might recall earlier in the presentation, I said that most of those detained and deported have been Latino working class men. And so when we think about families and the deportation of Latino working class men, usually the breadwinner, that means that families, usually the children and the wives, are getting left behind. And sociologist Joanna Derby calls this suddenly single motherhood. So these households experience where mothers have to sort of scramble for their family's economic stability after the breadwinner of the household has been detained or deported. And a study found that among families that experience detention and deportation, that they lose on average between 40 to 90% of their income. So some sociologists argue that this is creating an underclass of Latino working class families that are becoming more limited in resources. One more sort of economic implication that I want to highlight is some sociologists have run the numbers and estimated that to create a system that would actually ensure all undocumented immigrants be deported, it would cost about $9 billion a year. So it's a costly system even then, and costly system that we currently have. So I'm gonna jump back into my slideshow presentation. I didn't want to leave you in this talk just having talked about the negative implications. I also wanted to take a moment to highlight the efforts of individuals that have been working to change the immigration enforcement system. So I've been doing research with immigrant families and immigration attorneys and some immigrant rights advocates. And usually I interview these individuals to get an understanding of their experiences and perceptions. I've been doing that now for a couple of years as a PhD student. And this is one of the themes that constantly comes up, is the different ways in which individuals are trying to fight back. And so here on this slide, I'm sharing a quote from one of my first research projects while in grad school, where I was interviewing families who'd experienced this. And this quote comes from Rosa, who is the mom of Rosita, which she references in the quote. She and I were talking about her ex-husband's deportation that had occurred years prior. Her ex-husband had now been living in Mexico apart from her and her daughter. And she, in the conversation, was recalling how the immigration court proceedings happened. And here I'll read the quote and you can follow along. The judge did ask my ex-partner to have our daughter write a letter to the judge stating why her dad should stay. So she wrote a letter and even had a picture on it. And the letter just said, I want my dad to stay because he is my dad. On our days off, we go out as a family. So Rosita at that time was only about 6 or 7 years old. I met her a couple of years after. But even in her 6, 7 years of age, she was trying to find ways to contest the deportability label that the immigration court had given to her father. So we can look at this letter and see that this letter is a culmination and effort by her to try to make a case on behalf of her father. I also wanted to share what's happening at the LA city and county level. So here in LA, there is the LA Justice Fund. And this quote comes from a newspaper article, and I'll go ahead and read it. The LA Justice Fund was first announced by Mayor Eric Garcetti and other leaders in December, with Garcetti promising $2 million to the fund, the County Board of Supervisors pledging $3 million, and private donors pledging $5 million. The idea for the fund was formed as a response to Donald Trump's election and his vow to increase deportations of immigrants in the country illegally. So this fund, well, some of you may have heard of it, this fund allocates money for legal representation for LA County and LA City residents, and they can qualify through nonprofits. And this fund was a result of community organizers pushing LA City and County to implement this program. And this program, there's been similar ones occurring throughout the county and throughout the United States in different locales of funds pushing for universal representation or some kind of representation system within the immigration enforcement system. So I'm not sure if I mentioned, but if you or someone is detained by immigration detention, while you may have a right to an attorney, it doesn't come at the government's expense. So that person is on the hook for paying for their own immigration attorney. And these programs come in with the idea of trying to increase accessibility of immigration attorneys for people in detention. Finally, at the national level, there's various campaigns such as this one called First Hand to Communities, Not Cages, where individuals are trying to push back against detention centers. And as you can see in this image, one of the detention centers that they're trying to fight against is the Adelanto Detention Center, which is the one 2 hours away from us, where most people have been detained if they are LA County city residents. So with that, I'll have time for questions. I wanted to make sure that we had enough time for questions and a conversation about the major takeaways. So if you want to share a takeaway from the presentation, feel free to do so, or if you have a question, something that I can elaborate, feel free to do so. I think someone was going to help me with the Q&A as well.
Yeah, I didn't get any questions in the chat or directly to me, but I wanted to ask you about unaccompanied children who cross illegally. I understand, and I wanted to know if this is correct or not, and if you came across any research on this. That they do not get any legal representation when they go to, I don't know, ICE court, I want to say, or detention court. Is that correct?
From my understanding, yes. These individuals are having to represent themselves in immigration court. I do know that there are different immigrant nonprofits that take up these cases in LA that are trying to sort of fill in that gap.
I just remember stories of like 5-year-olds appearing before a judge without any legal representation or even the ability to speak English. So they didn't understand what's happening.
Right, because they can be pretty young children facing immigration court. I have some colleagues in mind that after the presentation, I can like send you their names, who do a lot more research and are experts on unaccompanied minors. But yeah, some unaccompanied minors do have to face immigration court by themselves.
Wow, amazing. And Alice has raised her hand, I think, with a question. Alice, go ahead.
Yes. Thank you very much for this, Priscilla. Your name's Priscilla, right? Is that
Blanca.
My name is Blanca.
Sorry. Okay. A question that I have is this. So what do you think about what's happening at the border right now? Like, for example, all those unaccompanied minors and everybody coming through. When we think about like the open borders in the way it is right now, isn't that just as dehumanizing and dangerous and Like I can't, my heart breaks thinking about all those kids, where they're going to go, who's going to take them in, how many kids are just lost. And isn't that just as terrible as coming here and then being deported? I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. I guess I just see those children and I think, wow. And everybody, right? Everybody coming over and sleeping in this dirt and there's no place to house them. And then what's next? Like, where do they go? How do they feed themselves? Where do they live? I don't know.
Yeah, these are all great. And like each of these questions could be its own separate research project. But one thing to think about and to start tackling those questions is by looking at what motivates immigration in the first place. What are the economic and structural conditions that push individuals to migrate? So there's plenty of research, and I'm not a full expert on this, but there's plenty of research that shows that, for instance, Central American migrants that are coming, some of those conditions have been pushed because of US intervention. And so when we think about the connections that are already formed between countries that have had interventions, by who they had interventions, and the connections between those countries is when migrants come from which places. So I'd encourage you to keep reading, Alice.
Yeah, so I guess my issue is, and of course, it's never going to be answered in a perfect world. Like, when are we going to actually tackle this? I know that there's small endeavors, throughout the city, but why was Garcetti motivated just because Trump was doing this? Like, if you look at the statistics you showed, Obama had, a pretty high amount of deportation numbers also. Why wasn't there money invested at that time? Like, how long are we going to wait till we address these things? It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And the quote that you're referring to, in my dissertation, I am spending a lot of time thinking about what they're expressing and how they're expressing as a motivating reason. When, as you mentioned, it's kind of paradoxical that under the Obama administration, which immigration advocates call as the deporter in chief, we didn't really see these programs popping up, at least not in LA, certainly not in LA. And it was only until President Trump came into office that we saw the mobilization and the implementation of these programs taking hold. So that's a really great question. And I am, in my dissertation, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about this paradox. So I'm glad you caught on to it, and I'm not the only one seeing the paradoxical nature of this.
Blanca, if you want to interview Garcetti, I may know someone who is a very good friend of his that I can connect you with.
That would be great. I'll write my email in the chat box. If you don't get a chance to ask me your question today, maybe you can send me an email and ask in the future.
I'll put mine in here too. And then if you're interested in, talking to some of those people, I can't guarantee, but I know she's a mover and a shaker. So she might be able to help.
Yeah, thank you, Alice. Anyone else have any thoughts they'd like to share? Thoughts, questions?
Hi, Blanca. Appreciate everything you've spoken about so far. I know it's not an easy subject to discuss by all means. It's obviously a very controversial one. And I'm curious as to what kind of got you into this work? Like what inspired you to, when, pursue a PhD and then to pursue a PhD on this topic itself?
Yeah, such a great question. So when I was in undergrad, I did my first research project I actually did it on intimate partner violence. If you look at my website or if you look me up, you can see that article on intimate partner violence. So in that study, I was interviewing a lot of my neighbors and people that I grew up with, and to try and understand their perspectives on intimate partner violence. And usually what would happen is that at some point we would end up talking about immigration enforcement. And immigration enforcement was almost, I want to say, like a boogeyman that we talk about, but like never quite see, like physically see. ICE officers physically see an immigration courtroom, physically see the ICE building in downtown LA. And I think at some point Itzel had mentioned too that like we don't hear about what happens in immigration detention centers, and partly that's because they're so far away from major urban areas. And so in those conversations, it usually was both, it's impacting our lives really heavily, but we've never actually like really seen the ICE processes. So then that got me motivated when I started my PhD to interview families who'd actually gone through this experience. And one of the questions that I usually end up asking them is, what advice would you have to other families who've gone through this experience? What would you share? And usually they tell me that that they recommend immigration attorneys. Almost everyone would tell me, I'd recommend an immigration attorney. I'd recommend an immigration attorney. But then at the same time, they would tell me like, oh, but be cautious about this, be cautious about that. Make sure they're actually showing up and doing the paperwork and talking to the judge and being good advocates. And so then as my research progressed, I started interviewing immigration attorneys themselves and how they manage within a system that's sort of set up for most immigrants of color, most Latino immigrants to be deterred, to face removal proceedings where there's less actual relief opportunities, and asking them how they do their work and how they face these issues. So that's my very long-winded story of how I came to do this work. Such a great question.
No, thank you for being so open about it. I know that Hoover had a question that I was also curious about. And he asked, have you ever encountered the argument that, quote, these people are breaking the law and they should be punished for it, end quote, like the police officer said in the short video clip? And how do you respond to that?
Yeah, such a great question. And to be perfectly candid, there were a couple individuals that I interviewed that had experienced detention and deportation in their families and said, well, and it was usually a father, well, my father broke the law, therefore detention and deportation should have been obvious that it was coming. And so that on a personal level, like that can be extremely heartbreaking to hear. But the sociologist in me would say that the law is in some ways socially constructed, right? That breaking the law prior to 1996 if you were a legal permanent resident and you broke the law through certain crimes, you would still retain your legal permanent residency. Post 1996, when the laws changed, it made it so that many more people were eligible for deportation. So I don't know exactly how I would exactly respond to those individuals, but this argument that these people are breaking the law, I think I would point out the like changing dimension of the law. And also, if we consider, for instance, the racial profiling, there's, as other sociologists have pointed out, there's disproportionate social groups like Latino working class men, like Black immigrants, that are disproportionately represented in our removal proceedings. So there's still something about the law and the system that finds certain groups of individuals over others. And that's important to also consider when facing ideas like this.
That definitely makes a lot more sense. And I know it's a very difficult question to answer, right? Because there's way more nuance in saying like yes or no. There's so much gray area. And I think when you talk about coming from a perspective of sociology, which really makes you question how it's even constructed in the first place, then it kind of makes that argument, I don't want to say easier to break down, but it makes it so that you can think about it in a very different perspective than just maybe in the black and white, which I do appreciate you pointing that out. When you were talking earlier about, immigration lawyering, have you been able to kind of talk to a lot of immigration lawyers about their experience and what it's like to kind of do this work every day, especially knowing that there's probably more losses than there are wins when talking about immigration?
Yeah, such a great question. And I think for our purposes, I'm going to focus on the Latina lawyers I've been interviewing. So there is a significant group of Latina lawyers in the LA metropolitan region. And what I find interesting about their approach to practicing immigration law is that they often reference giving back to their community as a motivating reason to enter immigration law and then to stay despite the losses, the hardships, the overwhelming nature of immigration enforcement, and for some even burnout and vicarious trauma that they experience. But their commitment to the larger immigrant Latino community is sort of what keeps them in their roles and position. And I think that might be something that resonates not only for Latina lawyers, but might resonate for a lot of Latino professionals that, have gotten a college degree, have gotten a more professional sort of position, and this commitment to give back as a reason for staying. And in this case with the Latina lawyers, even if it gets hard, even if there are more losses, even if it's more emotionally heartbreaking, their commitment can sometimes override that.
That's very good to know. I know it's difficult to work within this industry, let alone, the dehumanization and cruelty that I'm sure they're exposed to every day.
Right.
As we're kind of getting closer towards the end of the event, I'm just curious if there's one thing that you wish people took away from your work, your dissertation, or the presentation when it kind of comes to the subject, what would it be?
Yeah, I think to take away one thing from this presentation is just that it's been socially constructed for the past 20 years, and it's been a disproportionate burden for some social groups to bear over others. And if there is one thing to take away from my research and the little bit that I presented today, is that there are plenty of people in small and big ways trying to find avenues to protect immigrant individuals, immigrant families, and immigrant communities. And I think knowing those two things will help, hopefully help you all in the future deconstruct ideas about immigration and immigration enforcement.
Thank you so much, Blanca. We appreciate you, shedding some light on this very, very difficult topic, but we also appreciate you showing how there's different people working on the front lines to make sure that there is some justice in the injustices the community faces every day when it comes to immigration. So we really appreciate you coming and taking your time and effort to really talk about this in a very informative way. So thank you so much, Blanca. With that, we will be closing up our event. We saw you post your email if people want to contact you, but thank you so much again. We appreciate you.